You know, the Alien franchise, man, it's a lot like Terminator. When you go past the first two movies, that's when things start getting wonked out. That's when things take a turn for the worst. And there are good things to like about all of the Alien movies past Alien and Aliens, but they never recaptured that magic. They just didn't. There's interesting aspects of some of those sequels and prequels, but it just never hit the heights of the original two movies. But the talk going into Alien Romulus is that this new film, written and directed by Fede Alvarez, was supposed to course correct and put the series back in line by going back to what made those original two movies so great. And yeah, Alien and Aliens, I rewatched Aliens the other day and it still holds up. I mean, it might have the best third act of any James Cameron movie outside of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. You understand? Like, there was magic with those first two films, and the fact that the first movie was, in space, no one can hear you scream, this claustrophobic, slow-paced horror film, and the second one was an action film with horror elements. They are somewhat different in genre, but they both have the same spirit. But that spirit was really missing, and I'm not blaming David Fincher, and I'm not going to go into like the blame game because each filmmaker tried. It's not like they were trying to make a bad movie. It's just there were a lot of issues in the way. But with Alien Romulus, it's supposed to take a very back to basics approach where Alien needs to go back to being scary again. And the question is, can you put the rabbit back in the hat? Can you really make an Alien movie scary, considering that we have seen so much from the aliens, from the xenomorphs throughout the years, and we've seen so many different horror films. What could really be done? And I think the approach of just writing a good story, getting you to care about the characters, and actually make the alien terrifying again is possible. And Fede Alvarez is the right director, the right filmmaker to do it. Not only does this movie really, really try its best to recapture the magic of the first two, it's actually set during the timeline of the first two. It's not like a prequel like with the more recent Ridley Scott movies, and it's not super deep into the future like Alien Resurrection. This movie takes place during the 57-year time skip between Alien and Aliens, during that whole time when Ellen Ripley was asleep, but it acts like a side story because it's not about Ellen Ripley, because Ellen Ripley was asleep, obviously. It's a side story, sort of a self-contained story that still ties into the grand universe, but it doesn't get in the way of the events of Alien and Aliens. This is my non-spoiler review for Alien Romulus. No spoilers. This is for people who have not seen the film yet. I'm going to tell you whether or not I think that you should see it and whether or not the movie's for you, depending on the type of alien movie you like. And the good news is, if you're a fan of the first two, albeit they are two somewhat different movies, but if you're a fan of those first two, Alvarez really, really loves those films. And the good thing is, it didn't feel like nostalgia bait. It did not feel like he was trying to reference all these things like so many of these soft reboots tend to do. And some of them have worked out, some of them have not. But it certainly goes back to the atmosphere. That atmosphere that was so prevalent in the early films that was missing from the later ones. I mean, let's be honest. Alien Resurrection has no atmosphere. Some people love that movie. And whenever I see that movie, I just think it's low budget sci-fi, even though it didn't have that low of a budget. And Prometheus and Alien Covenant, those felt more like, in some ways, psychological thrillers. They were more thought-provoking. Now, I want to make this clear. Ridley Scott is still a producer here. So if you think that this is one of those films like what the Halloween series did, or like what the recent Exorcist movie did, where they just erased the sequels and only focused on the first two. No, there are tie-ins here to Prometheus and to Alien Covenant. Granted, I'm not going to sit here and say that you absolutely need to see those movies before you see this one, but there's one part in particular where they explain sort of the motive for a character that existed in a previous story, right? Again, I'm not going to go into details. That does reference what was discussed in Prometheus and in Alien Covenant. So this is still part of that timeline, but I actually thought the way they tied it in, I was pleasantly surprised because I felt like after Alien Covenant, and I did like that movie when I saw it, even though I haven't seen it in a long, long time. I did like it. It felt like the series was going in a direction that maybe even Ridley Scott wasn't sure about, even though there's a lot of like fan theories and controversy, because if you look at the history of Prometheus and Alien Covenant, like there's been behind the scenes stuff with the script, and so there's a lot of videos on YouTube here that go into like sort of the lore they were planning and the changes they made and this and that, but it does reference some things and it does borrow from other movies. It feels the most like Alien with a little bit of Aliens in there. It does feel the most like that. The dark corridors, hiding from the face huggers, the xenomorph, you know, all of that vibe. Except it's got sort of a color palette a little bit more like Alien 3, more reds, and as opposed to like the blue and gray of the second film and the first film. So that was interesting. And, you know, there's a couple of lines here that were straight up callbacks to previous movies. You know, there's actually one line in particular where I was like, okay, I know what you're trying to do there. I know what you're referencing, but a little bit on the cheesy side. You know what I mean? Like, it's a line that's repeated from a previous Alien movie that made sense in the context of that one, but maybe not so much this one. I don't know. It just didn't sit right with me. So it's not a perfect movie at all. I do want to address the whole thing about gore, because everybody was saying, oh, this is a gory movie. It's really gory. Look, maybe I'm desensitized to it. Maybe because I watch a lot of horror, it's not, to me, that... It was gory. There were a couple of parts that were very gory. That I will give it credit for sure. But I expected it to be this crazy gore fest based on the reactions of all the people online who saw it early, and it really wasn't a crazy gore fest. It did still keep the suspense and that sort of, you know, claustrophobic vibe of we're stuck in this space station. We're stuck. Because unlike a haunted house, you can leave a haunted house, even though some other horror movies make it very difficult. But when you're stuck in space on a ship, you can't go anywhere. And you know what they say in the original catchphrase, in space, no one can hear you scream, right? So you're on your own. You are on your own with this almost unbeatable organism. Now, I am going to say a couple things first of all. The performances were all great. I will say that some of the plot elements and some of the character choices I kind of saw coming. I was able to predict, okay, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, this is going to happen, and I was right on it. That's not always a bad thing. I know some critics do knock points away for that, but it's a tribute to Alien, so it is going to have some of the similar formula and some callbacks, but it wasn't like overly done, I didn't feel. The performances were all great, and the movie's almost entirely practical effects. Almost entirely. And not only are these effects very realistic looking and, you know, it looks great, but Alvarez went so far as to actually borrow the sound effects from the early movies. You could hear a lot of the same sounds of the early films. Now, once again, if you're going to ask me, well, could this actually have been Alien 1.5? Could this have actually, even though in the timeline it fits in between Alien and Aliens, could this have been a movie that was released in the early 80s before Aliens in some kind of like alternate universe? And the answer is no. And the reason why I'm saying the answer is no is because the references to Prometheus and to Alien Covenant were, albeit short, by the time you get to the third act, and what happens in the third act, let's just say that it's going to be very controversial. I could see some Alien fans hating what they did. I really could see it. It's pretty creative, I will say. It's something we've never seen before, at least not in this form. But it is something that I felt was, like, I didn't hate it. I understood exactly what they were going for. I didn't love it either. You understand what I'm saying? I wasn't totally over the moon over it. I still feel like the third act from Aliens, the James Cameron, the second movie, that's still just the most satisfying third act of anything. But here with this one, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't all that great in my opinion. So, is this the best Alien movie since Aliens? I would say probably, but it's not better than the first two. That I will say. It's not better than the first two, but it probably is the best one since Aliens, although it does depend on your taste, because I know a lot of people really like the more deeper meanings behind Prometheus, and Prometheus is definitely more of an auteur film. Of all the Alien movies, that's the one that was the most thought-provoking, the most unlike the other ones, right? And part of me does like that movie, even though I don't revisit it quite too often. It's not comfort food for me. Aliens is my comfort food. But this movie, I would say, certainly was respectful to the previous films. The explanation of where this xenomorph came from, it's going to, again, that may anger some people. I get it. Once again, I didn't hate it, but I am mixed on it. So there were a few things about this film that I thought were somewhat questionable, and I am leaving the movie with a few more questions than I was expecting. And maybe we'll get a sequel, or there'll be a Q&A or something. But there were some things where I felt, I don't know, there were things there were questions that were opened up that I felt didn't need to be opened up, but at the same time, I get why this is the route they chose. When you're doing an interquel between two movies, you have to figure out a way. It's very difficult. You have to figure out a way to tell this story while still paying respect to the films before and after it in the timeline without ruining the lore and those individual stories. It's not a very easy thing to do. And you have to remember that Aliens was a logical sequel to Alien in and of itself. So he had to figure out how to sandwich this movie in while still keeping the integrity of the other two films. And again, that's difficult. That's not an easy thing to do without creating some kind of plot hole. And there are a few things that could be a plot hole. Again, this is something that may be answered later if there's a sequel, but again, if you're looking for a film that's a lot like the first film, where it's, a xenomorph going around picking people off one by one, that's what you're going to get here with this film. I won't go into any specifics, but it is a thumbs up movie. If you're a fan of the Alien franchise, yeah, go see it. It won't hurt. It's a good date movie, I think. Gross in some parts, very gross, but still, that's part of Aliens, is kind of to gross people out. That's one of the charms of that franchise. So I'll probably come back with a spoiler review sometime in the next few days, so look forward to that. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Alien. If you haven't seen the movie, stay away from the comments, just in case you don't want to get spoiled. But that third act, I'll talk more about that in the spoiler review, because I have things I think. Anyways, that's it. I'm out. Take care.